Hey, thanks for checking in. It's the young boy Flacco Aries you tune into, and today we're going to be talking about one of the more unfaithful events of the offseason, which is Alex Albon losing his seat at Red Bull. Now, I'm only talking about this because Red Bull just announced that they're putting Albon in DTM, and I've never even heard of DTM before Red Bull announcing Alex Albon becoming affiliated with that series. Now, I just checked out the YouTube page, and their 2020 recap only has 13,000 views. Now, that's really pathetic, and again, it shows you the minimal coverage and retention people care about this series of motorsport. Now, I'm not disrespecting nobody, so don't get offended, but even if you are a hardcore DTM fan, I'm definitely not interested to talk about it, and there's just not much to talk about when compared to something like Formula 1. So today's video is not about DTM, it's about how Alex Albon ended up being in DTM and how his fall from the Formula 1 lineup came to be. First, we've always seen Albon as that humble guy who almost didn't make it to Formula 1. But there's a difference between being humble and not having the confidence to drive. And to be honest, I didn't really care about Albon and only started to pay attention to his drive in China when he scored that point starting from the pits. Now, the reason why he's been so likable back in Toro Rosso is that he's a humble dude and he was constantly compared to Pierre Gasly, who couldn't match Verstappen. And I think that comparison needs to be understood in an earlier context, which was that Charles Leclerc was also promoted up at the same time from the sister team of Alfa Romeo. So when people were seeing how Leclerc was doing against the four-time world champion like Sebastian Vettel, and then looking at how Gasly was doing against Max, people were like, get him the fuck out of there. Now, I'm gonna talk about Gasly later, but the point being that Albon had less attention on him and was just more likable with his come-up story and his ability to beat the backfield in a car with not so great of a package. This lack of confidence is good in the beginning. I think it became a huge deterrent last year. And there's a saying in sports, which is that if you're always looking at your opponent and not focusing on your own race, well, you're just gonna lose. And I think that's the complex that Alex Albon faced. He didn't feel confident enough with his own skills, and being compared to Gasly got in his head and similarly underperformed like how Gasly did in his stint in a Red Bull a year earlier. Now, this effect is similar to how we see in other drivers with more attention. Bottas, for example, is not a bad driver, but when compared to Lewis, always losing and having to explain why you're not equal is a very difficult thing to manage mentally, and it breaks you down. Albon has definitely been struggling mentally, and I think that's reflective of his drive. Like you've seen in the beginning of the season, he was pretty close to getting a podium, only to get spun by Hamilton again. That must have been a huge scar on him, because you see that in later races, he's scared to take more risks. Now, the second factor is that Gasly's performance this year has largely overshadowed Albon's. From his consistency to his Grand Prix winning performance, Gasly's fall from grace to then rise up from the ashes is a greater and more attractive story than Albon. It is also harder to root for him when Gasly won a Grand Prix only for Albon to get his first podium in the next race. Like, the ordering of what came first has a huge impact on how we see Albon, because we expected him to perform extremely well and almost competitive with the Mercedes, only to be running with the midfield with no hint of scoring good points. This is the definitive understanding as to why people wanted Albon out of the Red Bull seat. You can't support somebody in such a competitive car even if you support them based on their prior experiences. And this has been one of the struggles this year with Albon. I've been a growing fan of his since his first year, and I really wanted him to succeed when he was struggling last year. But then I really wanted him out at the end because of Paris. Now, I'm going to talk about another thing, which is that Gasly's factor also has another thing to do with nationality. Gasly being French will draw French loyal support and coverage, whereas Albon being Thai, he doesn't really have an English predominant support that is more globally recognized for fans to pay attention to. This is why Gasly's Grand Prix win was far more exceptional with greater coverage in Europe than either of Albon's podiums. And also, Gasly overtook him several times in a Toro Rosso, so there's that as well. Another factor is that you cannot consider Albon's fall without looking at Verstappen. Now, Albon's lack of confidence and humbleness means that Red Bull, including Verstappen, really gets along with Albon because his ego is not an issue. However, on race day, Verstappen clearly outmatches Albon, and that's the thing we see with drivers paired up with him, including Ricciardo. Now, I saw an interview lately where Verstappen adamantly said that he beat all the drivers while they were in Red Bull, and I saw the comments people backing up Ricciardo saying how he was doing better. Now, let me go on a tangent to say you don't beat another driver only to leave for another team mid-season. There is a reason why Ricciardo left, and that's because he's performing at the same level as Verstappen, but being older, this will shift the focus of the entire team to prioritize the younger, more talented driver. This is why Ricciardo left, because he lost the confidence of the team, and clearly, he knew that as well. So to anyone who still backs up the Ricciardo horse, you need to understand that Max indeed beat all of his teammates. And so going back to this topic, again, Albon is older, but had less experience in the car. And so losing to Verstappen now seems even more embarrassing, as it shows that you don't have the talent to be someone younger than you. And yet it took longer in the feeder series to end up with the seat. So being in that other seat at Red Bull, you'll always be faced with comparisons to Max Verstappen. And being that it's Red Bull, you'll always get more attention. Now, the fourth and final factor has been that Perez's performance this year has been phenomenal. And it's crazy to think that for a while he wouldn't get a seat for next year. Now, It was also weird because everyone was saying how if Vettel wasn't signed by August 1st, then that meant that Perez wasn't staying at Racing Point. However, Lawrence Stroll has a fuck ton of money and he doesn't give a fuck. So again, looking at Perez being another race winner that wasn't in a Red Bull and was also out of a drive for next year, you're gonna naturally compare him to Alex and you'll want him to be in that Red Bull seat for next year. I think one of the greatest talents of Perez has been his tire management, and the only person I've seen do better on the current grid is Lewis Hamilton. Perez's performance comes from his stints earlier in Force India, where he had to carefully manage his parts. That is a skill that he developed, which is advantageous in the sport today, with single pit stops being the most common strategy on race day. So we could see how Perez's consistency plus a good competitive car leads to significant points, which Red Bull so desperately needs, as it'll bring the competition to Mercedes next year now that Perez is a great tool for strategy on race day. The lack of a number 2 driver which can pull an undercut is seriously disadvantageous for Max when he has to keep running with the Mercs and pit whenever they pit, only to lose out on pure performance. Strategy has been a clear lacking with Albon, and that's something Red Bull wants, considering the rules for next year are exactly the same as last season. And so compositely, these factors really is how I see the whole situation with Albon. And if you ask me now if I have any consoling or remorse feelings for Albon, I really don't. Like how I mentioned in the Alonso video, no one really cares about those who fall out of Formula 1. Like Stoffel Van Dorn, who lost a drive in 2 years time and now I could not give a fuck about. So it may seem heartless, but so be it. I care about good drivers and not those that are dropped. Alright, if you like this video, smash that like button, and if you like what I talk about, then subscribe. I'll check you guys out in the next video. Peace.